It's an Archaeodeath interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome everybody to this latest Archaeodeath interview, and today I'm joined by Ellie Chambers, a doctoral researcher in my department at the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Chester. Hello Ellie.
Hi.
So we're going to talk about all things to do with the public archaeology of bioarchaeology, or the public engagement with bioarchaeology. So before we go into that story of your ongoing doctoral research, of which really you've only just started, but I wanted to talk to you because it's such an exciting and distinctive area of research. I thought, it'd be a good opportunity to meet you and everyone to get to know you and your backstory, why you think the topic's more broadly a significant one, before we learn a little bit about what you're actually going to be doing in terms of your doctoral research. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, start off by asking, who are you and where do you come from? How did you get into archaeology and into doctoral research?
Well, archaeology, I think it's sort of an answer that you've been given before, that it's just so interdisciplinary that I liked too many subjects at school and I enjoyed them so much that I didn't want to give any up. So I thought the best way to combine them is archaeology. And I've always been interested in the past. I grew up with like horrible histories and things that I think there's a lot of historical research aimed towards kids in the early 2000s when I was growing up. And actually the other day I remembered that when I was really young, I had this huge TV in my room. Well, I say huge, like small but big for modern standards. And I used to, after my bedtime, turn the volume down to about 2 and stand next to it and watch Egyptology documentaries so that my parents couldn't hear, because I just thought it was so amazing and I wanted to know more, but it was on too late. And I just kept up my interest. And when I got to the time to pick a subject at uni, it just seemed like the best fit. I was looking at different courses and I thought that the range of modules available, I went to Nottingham, were amazing. And that even if I was brand new to archaeology as a subject to study, I didn't manage to do it at A level or anything, but I thought I can find sort of whatever route I want from this because there's so many different things available to me, which I really liked. I loved science and I loved history and I didn't want to give anything up. And I haven't, I've been greedy, kept it all.
Well, I know a few colleagues at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Nottingham, and it's certainly a fantastic campus, great university, and some wonderful research and teaching going on there. And what kind of things that you didn't, obviously we know where you went on and what you're doing now, but what kind of other things did you do in your undergraduate degree to give people a flavour of what you were up to?
There were so many. So I did classics at A level, and I love ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And at Nottingham, there was modules about the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, and that was definitely something I considered. But in my first year, we had to do a field school or some sort of practical work, and Kev Coots of the Polton Research Project down the road from Chester came and gave a talk about how brilliant the Polton Project is. And I was just completely sold, went and excavated human remains and just never looked back. I was completely taken over by it. And I could have easily gone down a more classical route. There was also underwater archaeology, archaeobotany and animal remains, which I was a little bit less interested in. But as soon as I'd excavated human remains, I knew that's where my interest lay and where I wanted to carry on.
I didn't realise we had Kevin to blame. We'll have to get him on another interview, actually, because Kevin's a lovely guy and it's a really important research project, not affiliated with our department, but, in the Cheshire, not far from Chester, in the Cheshire area. And it's a long-term excavation of a medieval chapel site. So, yeah, that's a fantastic way into sort of the excavation of human remains. So what happened then? You finished your 3-year undergraduate degree. Hooray! Why stay on and do more?
I hadn't learned enough, I guess. I'm a big geek. I love learning, and I got to the end of my undergraduate and I'd developed an interest in human remains, and I'd had a small amount of education in things like stable isotope analysis and ancient DNA, and I just thought it was fascinating, but there wasn't enough of it in my undergraduate, which is nothing against Nottingham. It just isn't a specialism that they like promote in the same way as some other things that they do. So I saw that they offer a bioarchaeology master's at York, and it was just like a dream come true. It was exactly what I wanted to study. And I was lucky. I think York is a really well-designed program because even though I was doing bioarchaeology, they're so generous with the different modules that you can take. I also took community archaeology modules and ethnoarchaeology and things that aren't strictly scientific, but I think gave me a better understanding of archaeology and let me pursue my own passions, which was really brilliant.
So you got to do extra things you'd never encountered before at York, as well as more specialist things that you'd encountered a little bit. So it's that's why you stayed on. That's really interesting. And of course, so you've got two of the most sort of prestigious archaeology departments in the country as your sort of on your CV, so to speak. And then you've been doing other things before you started at Chester, I think. Isn't that right? You've been.
Yeah. So I've got. I'm still like in my early 20s, so my career isn't very long. But I between my undergraduate and my masters, I kind of took advantage of the commercial unit temporary contracts. So a lot of commercial archaeology units will employ people for a month, and generally those roll on. But I decided to just take it up for a month and gain some experience between the two. I didn't enjoy it very much. It was boiling hot and I didn't find anything. I was just digging in a quarry. And I thought, okay, well, that's told me not to go into commercial. That's good. So when I came out of my master's, I decided to go into museums because growing up again, I've always been taken to museums by my parents. We grew up about an hour and a half away from London. So it used to be go up on a Sunday, go to the National Museums for a cheap day out. And so I started applying for museum jobs, which are quite difficult to actually get into or find. But luckily, I managed to get one quite quickly after my master's at the Imperial War Museum in Salford. So I was working, well, I am working. I'm just about to leave, so I'm using the past tense. But my current job is in customer service, but it's sort of in the office, dealing with the 5 museums, lots of questions from the public about their research, their family history, more general museum questions like membership, copyright of items in the collection, sort of anything you can think of to ask a museum, we'd have answered it. And I obviously am doing my PhD now, so I went down to part-time doing that, and I'm just about to take on a new role. So I'm leaving IWM tomorrow, and I am I'm moving to Manchester Museum to help with their learning program to set up the sort of science learning sessions for when they reopen next year. So that should be really exciting.
Well, I think almost everyone watching this wants to be you, both as your past jobs and your exciting role. That's wonderful, and it's also good, I think, for people to hear that the journey people go on. They're not quite sure. They try things out that aren't necessarily for them, and not all archaeology is commercial sector field archaeology. And it's certainly, I did lots of field archaeology on research projects and some commercial archaeology, but I must admit it wasn't for me. I could never see that as my route either. So.
My month in commercial archaeology, if you speak to my dad, is the last time I had any involvement with archaeology. Despite my master's and my current PhD, when I got my new job, he was like, so will you be going back into archaeology now? Because he's just, even though he has someone in his life who is, involved with archaeology and tries to tell him all the different things about it, he just doesn't see it as anything beyond digging. And my mum tries to explain it through the Bone Detectives, the TV show, where there's a group of bioarchaeologists who do stable isotope analysis and ancient DNA and things. And she's like, it's more that side.
It's amazing how tenacious and sometimes quite insidious that sort of stereotype of archaeologists being in the field all the time is. Like even in the commercial sector, 90. I don't know what percentage, but a large fraction of your time will not be spent in the field. Even if you are all year round commercial archaeology, you'll have to be doing the post-ex, the write-ups. This is a lot of work in the office. So, but still, anyway, it doesn't necessarily help us that stereotype is out there, because so much of what we do is about working with objects, working with ideas, working whether we it drives me crazy. I'm reminded of an anecdote from when I was a undergraduate, though. My first, I'd done some digs before I went to university, but I was on a first dig with the university training survey, and I made the joke in a context about I'm an archaeologist now, obviously tongue in cheek, and someone really knocked me down and said, "You're not an archaeologist till you've finished your degree." And I had been joking. They had thought I was being serious, but it does make me wonder about, well, what do you have to be an archaeologist? And there's such a imposter syndromes out there anyway. I mean, and it really sort of struck me as, oh, when do I become an archaeologist? I mean, was there a moment for you where you suddenly thought, hang on, no, I do feel, I may not know everything, but I feel I've got I know what I'm doing now? And when do you feel you could use the title?
I don't know. I don't know if that's happened yet. I think it's such a strange thing because it
It
seems
should
so
be.
small to say I'm an archaeologist. You're not saying anything sort of insanely profound, but I
No.
agree. It is something that you kind of do feel that you have to earn, but there is no real way to earn that. And I don't know if someone would say it's when you've like, excavated an entire site or if you're publishing a paper, and there's so many different levels. But really, I think if you're a student studying archaeology, or even if you're a volunteer and you have a day job, but you're volunteering at a site, you're an archaeologist. It's so broad. It's whenever you choose to define it. So I would say I'm an archaeologist now, but even then, it still feels a little bit uncomfortable for absolutely no reason.
I must say I've never been comfortable with it, and I still go, "Am I really? I'm an archaeologist yet?" But my point is, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one where people are very gatekeepy about this and want to sort of say, "Oh no, you've got to be an archaeologist until you've done X, Y, and Z." But there's so many different ways of being an archaeologist that I think it's important people feel it's an inclusive thing. But anyway, that was just an interesting aside, really. I wanted to ask you then about this really good to learn about your undergraduate degree, your master's, your experience in field, and then multiple museum jobs. But what made you think about doing doctoral research, and why the kind of area, this interest in bioarchaeology and public engagement, Ellie? What was that? What grabbed you about that?
Um, I think again, I came out of my master's thinking there is more that I want to do, and that sort of naturally went into a PhD in my mind. But I also, one, couldn't afford to do a PhD when I came out of my master's, but I also wanted it to be something that I really cared about. I looked at some of the PhDs that were funded, and they looked lovely and very relevant, and I could have actually afforded to live and things on them, but they just wouldn't have held my interest and they weren't what I was passionate about. So I wanted to make sure I was doing something that I cared about. And in my master's, I wrote basically a 4,000 word essay that I'm now turning into a PhD, which was about my current research interests, which really, I guess, bioarchaeology, I think people are fascinating. And the archaeology is the study of people. But when you're talking about bioarchaeology, it's not an abstract sense of past people and past communities. It is a person that you're studying. And I really enjoy that. Um, and for public engagement, I think that that's really significant that when we're talking about people, we shouldn't be gatekeeping that information and we should be feeding that back to the wider communities. I really came to having an interest in public engagement through politics, I would say. So I started my undergraduate in 2015, which was just after an election. By the end of my first year, we'd had Brexit. In my second year, we had a second election. So there was this whole political turmoil going on sort of in the outside world whilst I was studying archaeology. And it just became so natural for me to put the two together that then I started to look for the politics in archaeology and the misuses or the positive uses. And I think inevitably, when you're talking about politics and when you're talking about archaeology, they're both so inherently about people that public engagement is just such a natural part of that. That if someone is going to, or a politician will say that, the people who made Stonehenge were the two Brits and we, should only care about their descendants, then that affects the public in a significant way. And the way that archaeologists can counteract that is through public engagement. So that's kind of where those thoughts lined up. And then whilst I was going through the pandemic, as everyone did, I didn't get furloughed until earlier this year. So I had sort of a dip at one point in my workload last year where the museums were shut. They didn't want to furlough us, but they didn't really have enough work to keep us going. So they encouraged us to do training modules. And one of those training modules was about fake news. And so I thought that sounds interesting to me. I'll have a look at it. And it reminded me of my essay that I'd written about how archaeology is presented in the press, which is now what my PhD is about. And I thought now might be the time that I want to apply for a PhD. So I started putting together a proposal and getting my thoughts in line before I approached someone. And I was looking around for a really long time to try and find the best supervisor because I live in Manchester. So I thought Manchester University is brilliant, but none of the staff had the research interest that I wanted. And I knew from being at York and at Nottingham that this was something that academics care about, but maybe don't necessarily focus on, and that they couldn't sort of supervise me in the way that I needed. So I kept reading, I kept looking. I was happy to move across the country, but then thankfully I read Adrian Maldonado's Serialized Past, where he introduces talking about Chester. And I thought, oh, Chester, I hadn't considered Chester. And I had a look, and suddenly it all kind of fell into place. And I thought, yes, now this is a place where I think my PhD will be sort of well cared for. I will be supported. Luckily, it's just down the road, so it's not too far away from me. And the department's goals aligned with what I saw my PhD becoming.
That's really interesting, because there are a few funded PhDs out there, but of course they're not always on the topics that you particularly want to do at the time you want to do it. And I've had some rhetoric, people saying, oh, only go for funded PhDs. And of course that isn't the ideal route, but equally some of the most important topics at the timing of this topic, I think, is absolutely crucial. So I'm delighted you're working with us on this, and at this time, because I think this is a time where it matters more than anything that we do further research on the challenges of public engagement with human bodies and human body parts and human remains. And you're focusing mainly on. Well, let's go on and talk about your research then, because that sort of naturally flows in. So you're focusing mainly on the UK and media representations of, or misuses, or how professionals work with the media or against the media. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I'd say that's about right. So I'm looking at how, I think primarily the interest is in how archaeology is presented in the press. And because of the way the press is going at the moment, that is online news media and social media, because they're very interconnected. And going beyond that, it can seem sort of fairly innocent of just, I mean, I say innocent because it's generally misrepresenting the actual story. So it will be a great revelation that ancient humans used flint or something. That's not really actually that shocking. But then within bioarchaeology, because the subjects that we study can become controversial in the way that they can be politicized, they can sort of redefine how we assume the British past to be. And that feeds a lot into nationalism and politics. I'm specifically looking at studies that concern sort of, I guess, British identity. And within that, a lot of it comes from, I see it as white nationalism and the belief that Britain has always been a white country, white and somehow always having lived on this particular piece of land. So from Europe or from the world, it's seen as sort of not British. And there are some really interesting studies being done, but then when they get to the press, they become this sort of political beast that goes beyond what we could have ever predicted. Yeah, so the press will take these stories and they will sort of adapt them to a modern context, because that then makes people more interested in it. They'll put a clickbaity headline to get more attention, or sometimes, I guess, it can come from ignorance. Journalists are trying to frame this in a way that they understand so that they can then explain it to other people, because a lot of the time these journalists will not be archaeologists. They might not be historians that have absolutely nothing to do with this, but they've been told to go and write a paper on it or read a press release and write an article. And this is what they've come up with. I don't think it's always inherently sort of vicious or evil, but it can become that, especially if the narrative that's being told isn't one that archaeologists are intending. And again, I'm focusing on studies that kind of start off as something that can be provocative, but it's not always that way. There are lots of studies being published in the press that, because of the context they're set in, if you have evidence from an Egyptian tomb that a mummy would have been eating an animal that had been transported from Sicily, next to an article about how there's Brexit food shortages, then suddenly that mummy gets put into an EU relationship that it should never have been put into, but that's how the public are reading it. And we need to be really conscious of this context, that even if our study isn't sort of contentious, isn't political, it's going to be politicized. And that's generally, I think you could see it as a bad thing, but it's just a fact at this point. It's something that is happening. We have to accept it's happening, and we need to work on ways to mitigate that. And when it is a story that is inherently controversial or sort of challenging at the very least, then that escalates and it gets put into a much worse position.
So by the end of your PhD research, you'll be able to give us some concrete recommendations and evaluations of what's been going right, what's been going perhaps not so well for how archaeologists are working with the media, but how the media are working themselves. But at this stage, it's early days. So for viewers, please bear in mind, Ellie's got detailed research ahead of her. But have you got any sort of hints as to what you're finding out?
Well, I'm sort of in the lit review stage, so I think at this point, it's something we need to start accepting. People are doing work on it. I'm not being innovative here, but there is a clear sort of opposition to it and an apathy, I guess, where people say, that's not going to happen to me. My research is exempt somehow. And I think we need to accept that it's happening is the first point. And then the strategies to actually deal with it, I think, are difficult. We need to have a lot more control over press releases, or if not control, then awareness of what should be in them, what could be in them. I was even thinking the other day, I don't see why we can't put in a disclaimer that says this should be read within the context of the society that it was studied. We should not be applying modern political thought to this, and the author distances themselves from any misuse. And I think that could be just a way from the start to kind of, I don't know if a journalist would ignore it, but at least it puts it out there. And then if something does happen where a study kind of goes viral, or something happens where the media sort of put it in such a way that people start to bring up white nationalism, racism, sexism, any sort of bigotry, then we need to be willing to defend it. And that's the point that's particularly, I think, troubling and scary, because the way you defend it is on social media if you're dealing with the public. Generally, that is the modern forum. And that opens you up to a lot of abuse, threats, hatred. It's a scary place to be. So there needs to be some more institutional backing and support for that as well. And I guess training. And it needs to just be more accepted that if you're willing to publish, and you know that study could be put in the press, which is quite a nice thing to happen for your research, you'd like to think that people are interested in it, then we're going to have to accept that the modern world is moving to the point where then you're going to have to defend it in a sort of arena like a gladiator and just be very willing to fight to the death for it.
I suppose that's the challenge, isn't it? Is the labour, the work, the emotional potential damage and mental damage of arguing. Is there any way we can ever convince anyone, if they're already against the evidence and the arguments we're making, if they won't subscribe to archaeological inquiry and processes and understand, are we just wasting our time? Because I think some archaeologists have give up and have times where they have to stop because it's so exhausting. And but what do you feel about that? Because sometimes I have moments, as you can probably guess, where I despair. But what's the point if, and even in the articles where I say that I got, say a blog article, I just saw one recently where I've actually said, and my conclusion to this post is this, and I still see people saying, what's he getting at here? I don't understand this. This is just a waste of time. This is just some liberal this, or what's this point? He's missed the whole point. And I just quote back to them what I say, because they haven't read it. They haven't, it never engaged beyond the first word. They've seen whatever word is in the title. They haven't even read the title, let alone a few paragraphs. And that just makes me feel that despair. So I'm inspired that you say we should fight the good fight, but sometimes I feel so tired by it. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe I'm naive and I'm too early in my research, so I need to get sort of downtrodden a little bit.
No, don't do. It's great.
I think that you can't convince everyone, and the people that you can't convince are the most vocal. So there are so many people who will scroll past a tweet telling them that actually this is the research and here is what I actually found, or sort of correcting something. They'll read it, they'll think, oh, okay, and move on. But at least they've read it, and they'll never like it. They'll never reply saying, oh, thank you, now I've learned something. But it has happened. And there's no way of sort of studying that or qualifying it. You can't see those results. But it's so impossible for them not to be happening that you've just got to accept that someone will have been affected positively. And I think that that's really helpful to remember. And the people who are sort of adamant and they've decided that there's nothing that can change their minds, I don't see them as a lost cause, but I think especially when we're talking about archaeology and history, people think they know the past because it's not something that they sort of see as beyond their perception. It's not astrophysics where you say, well, yes, I wouldn't understand what a white dwarf is doing. They think, oh no, here is British history. I learnt it in school, or I've seen this documentary, or so many different things that they see the version of the past that they sort of want to see or that they've been taught, so that's what they understand it to be. And that's not a bad thing. It's sort of the re-education that I think is the main struggle for archaeology, that we say, actually, that was thought in the 80s, but we don't think that anymore because we've listened and we're more intersectional and we've, worked this out, and now we're much more understanding what gender means, and here are all these reasons. But it's quite hard to convince someone of that. So I think another aspect to this is getting in early with the new generations coming through, because I mean, younger generations already have different takes, and they are having a completely different education from when even I was in school because of the changes that came in 2013, I think. But they can be more open, and if we're able to talk to the curriculum boards and say, here's how we're teaching history, and here's why we think it should be a little less strict and rigid on facts, and here are the different archaeological aspects that we need to bring in, and sort of expanding from a younger age, I think can be really important. So it is hard, and there will be people who will go to their graves not agreeing and thinking that we're sort of all out to promote some agenda. And it's difficult when a lot of archaeologists are pretty left wing, and that can feel a little bit exclusive against some people who prefer like a right wing politics, or they are, very big supporters of Britain and nationalism, which archaeologists often are arguing against. And it can definitely seem as though we're some club that's trying to keep them out and telling them that everything they ever believed is wrong. In some aspects we are, and that's not a bad thing necessarily, but I think we can't expect to win everyone over. And we've just got to try with the people that we can try with. And there are so many groups that we haven't tried with enough yet. As we've discussed, community archaeology.
Yeah.
Archaeology is so homogenous in the UK. It's scary that there are so many underrepresented groups, peoples, that if we can't win over a very right-wing man in his 60s, then maybe we could try for a sort of apolitical woman from a Muslim community who's a teenager. I think we can redivert our attention and maybe see more success.
I think that's a really important point, because I think that academics are drawn into, we've discussed this a lot, in supervisory meetings, but we don't have to bring it all in here. But I think archaeology, my feeling is, which viewers may disagree with or may not deny is an issue, but I think it's a big issue, is that archaeologists are drawn into trying to respond to the more extreme and loud voices. And actually, there's a lot of very quiet, considered people out there, regardless of which particular political party they voted for, who do understand, do feel ownership, do feel they can relate on grounds of not necessarily their own personal story, but because of their humanity with stories from the human past. And that's why that's the blessing and curse of why people are invested in it. But it's often those people are the ones that we should be giving attention to, rather than constantly setting up straw men because some idiot has said something on the internet, and that's the enemy. We must be trying to combat that myth. No, that one dumb idiot in that one tweet said that. He may or she may not even believe that, or they may not believe that. But at the end of the day, they've said that maybe to be provocative, but they are not the enemy, because they probably don't even exist. We've really, our game has got to be set with our agendas of what we want people to learn. And yes, there'll be the voices that will say almost anything to be a contrarian, but we have to have an ethical stance, whether it's on issues that affect indigenous communities, affects issues of illicit trade in antiquities and human remains, whether it's on museum display, whether it's on how we interpret the ADNA of a Mesolithic skeletal remains from a cave in Somerset. It's not just about the people that are quickest and loudest, but it's about those broader communities. As you say, they're the ones that suffer in the end if all we do as academics is counter the extreme voices. It's the woman in her 30s with a Muslim background, maybe South Asian ethnicity, maybe has lived in this country all her life, or her, but feels disowned from these whole conversations because all she sees is shouty voices and archaeologists going wrong, 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 and no one's talking about what her view on any of this is. And I feel that is something that I think again and again we miss. And I don't know I don't have an answer, and I'm not saying I have a cure, but I think that's where we've got to think about where we target. And as you say, the homogeneity of the practitioners and the audiences sort of feed off each other, I think, a lot. Yeah. So yes, so what do you think, what case studies have you been dabbling in these early stages of your lit review that have grabbed your attention, that have fascinate you in recent years in the media, that maybe shed a light on this whole challenge?
The ones that I'm picking out, the most recent one that came out was the stabilized isotope analysis of the Mary Rose crew, which was already known. I saw it in the press and I read the article and I thought, I went to the Mary Rose Museum 3 or 4 years ago and this was up as an exhibit, that there were people from, I think it's like southern Iberia and the northern Africa and sort of around the Mediterranean. So it wasn't actually anything new, but the isotopes were new to sort of back that up as evidence. And it was going into the press and people were either sort of saying, well, of course, everyone knows this, or saying, oh, well, that makes sense because they were slaves, which I think is really interesting because a lot of the time our sort of discussions about like people of color in the past, especially from a historical perspective, revolve around slavery. I think, I don't want to get it wrong, I think it was Oxford Archaeology had a Black History Month where they were putting up about archaeological digs with like sort of excavating human remains that would have been sort of Black people of color in the past, to say the work they were doing. And I think of the 4 that they put up, 3 of them were slave sites, and it's damaging. It's not the only history that Black people have in this country, but it is the way that the Mary Rose crew was interpreted.
So what you're saying is it's not the individual stories and not a problem with telling the story of the transatlantic slave trade. It's the fact that because of that, some of the people who responded to the media story presume they must be slaves because they're people of not even whatever non-insular origin, or at least non-Northwestern European. Okay, yeah. Right. Okay, that's really, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, and I think that's where the education comes in, because if we only talk about Black people in the UK and Black history through slavery, then anytime you see a Black person in history or archaeology, people default to slavery.
So, I don't know, I don't have a solution, but how do we get at those core cliches or stereotypes and challenge them before we build up on it? I don't know. It's a difficult one.
Yeah, I think so much of it comes from the history syllabus at school. I mean, like you just said about the Vikings, I learned about the Vikings, the Viking world. We saw all the maps and it was all Northern Europe. And then they sort of conveniently cut off the Islamic Empire and everything that was going on sort of in Spain and Iberia. And there's no discussion about that. There's no question that anyone apart from the Vikings were ruling the world, even though it's not the case. And it's the same that happened to Mary Beard a few years ago, saying that shockingly, there could be a Black centurion, because what we teach in schools is so white and is so limited, and we just it's not even taking modern Britain and putting it on the past, because modern Britain is diverse. It's taking a Victorian Britain realistically, and putting that into every past sort of era, and it's just a persistent myth. And I'd like to think that teaching has moved on in the 10 years since I was doing my GCSEs, and that there will be new teachers coming up, or old teachers reviewing what they're doing, especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement last year, calling for changes to the history curriculum. I would like to think that is coming and that those changes are happening. But I think it does, as you say, if a lot of people, I think those sort of school narratives stick with someone, and if that is the history they're taught in school, it's very hard to then go back and actually sort of introduce any new information or revisit anything that they've been taught. And that is where these sort of the back of their mind subconsciously, I think, I never heard about, Black people in the past, but weren't they slaves? And then that suddenly becomes the only interpretation that can be made.
So the Mary Rose is a really fascinating case. So that led us down a whole interesting discussion about one thing. And one area of the persistent myths, and I'm really interested in how, whether we blame the Victorians for all of this, which is what everyone does, or whether we have to take ownership and say that these ideas are, yeah, we can say it's older books, older, but come on, I learned this stuff in school. My point is, I'm not a young person, and these myths have been debunked and again. It's an active choice to disregard and misrepresent these paths, in my view. And yes, isotopic studies coming out confirming these broader stories. Why is there such resistance? Well, we know why there's such resistance to this narrative, and why does it have to be, oh, we're debunking it again? Because I have a fear that in 50 years time, with a whole raft of new scientific techniques, we're still going to have to debunk these things again and again. But anyway, that's my cynicism coming in. But I mean, what other kind of case studies do you think have particularly sort of drawn your attention?
Well, the one that kind of kicked it all off when I was doing this similar essay in my master's was Cheddar Man, because I love Cheddar Man. He's so interesting. The reaction is so interesting because people, I think, again, there's a sort of general understanding that human origins come from Africa and that everyone started off black. But then as soon as you say, well, the oldest human skeleton in the UK would have had dark skin, suddenly people go, oh, hang on, we didn't think it happened here on this piece of rock. That can't possibly be right. And it really, it fed into a lot of racist discussions, white nationalism especially. Even if you wouldn't consider yourself a white nationalist to the sort of neo-Nazi extent, people see Britain as a white nation, and that any sort of people of colour have come from the empire or migrated since, and that any diversification has happened in the past 100 years. And I don't think it's right to sort of use Cheddar Man as an example of past diversity. That's not what it is. It's just that the understanding of skin colour in the UK or on this particular piece of rock isn't what we've always expected. And we can't, I don't know, I think it became politicised, and it came into all these conversations about race, and really a lot of conversations is disliking archaeologists for promoting an agenda. And what that agenda is, I'm not sure. They never really say. It's just always an agenda. I guess
it's a challenge, isn't it? Because Cheddar Man, I mean, about a decade ago, the far right were claiming the Mesolithic as indigeneity, and they make it up as they go along. And that's the whole problem, is they change the narrative. So whether it's the English, the Romans, almost anything can be called indigenous as long as it isn't the people you want to target and exclude. And then you can claim, oh well, 19th century Britain was all this, and we see the characters with their big YouTube channels mouthing off about this all the time, and it's really disconcerting. I mean, I have to confess, just as an aside, my base prejudice against Cheddar Man is that I can't envisage him as white, black, or anything. I just see cheese. I'm a bit of a cheese obsession on the side, and all Cheddar Man, cheese. I don't think about people. I just think about dairy products, which is my own personal bias and prejudice, is all I can think of is Somerset and dairy products. Anyway, so that's an aside. But Cheddar Man, cheese. Sorry, where was I? Yes, totally blank, you see, because of cheese. But it's really amazing how so much gets boiled into these archaeological finds, and the researchers had to do so much discussion of that, and with the ADNA. I mean, do you think ADNA has brought a whole new set of benefits or challenges for bioarchaeology and pottery archaeology?
I guess both. I mean, it's amazing that we can find this out, and that we can analyze a skeleton, and we can find out things that we would otherwise never know. We know the color of his eyes. That's incredible to me. But it does also lead to problems with people sort of criticizing the techniques and saying that ADNA is, unusable, and there's so many problems with it. I think also I'm concerned that because this is something that's happening a lot in society, or there's a lot of conversation about sort of race, ethnicity, whatever. I'm concerned that archaeology will now use ADNA and, I guess, stable isotopes to an extent to go back to our origins of sort of racial typologies and have such a focus on race that we're just, ancient DNAing as much as we can to try and find out people's skin color without a sort of actual hypothesis or research question in mind, because we want to do nice things for society and say that, people of color have lived in this country forever. But really, when we talk about people of color or black people or even just race, that we're talking about a modern context. And, you know, Cheddar Man wasn't black. He had dark skin because black is now associated with cultural connotations that are completely separated from the way that he lived his life. So I do have concerns that archaeology will move to a point where we're sort of we're using science to try and do better for society, but actually there's nothing behind it. It's not meaningless, but it's not really addressing what we need it to address.
I think we've already got the problem. We can't blame the public and their ignorance for this. We've already seen the rise of race science again. And open access is another challenge because everyone can claim to dip into these scientific papers. So you can all access these papers, and by reading the abstract, we think we know what they say. And yet you do need the training to understand. And the same with the ADNA research, which I don't purport to be an expert on. You know, it's how do you read that evidence? What does this tell us? And if it's all being, you know, boiled down into a reductive, you know, modern racial framework, we have some real challenges there. I mean, Cheddar Man's just one of many. I think we're going to have these ongoing issues. But my agenda, well, my concern is particularly with the ancestor worship. That, you know, it's not so much the color or appearance, which is one fixation, as much as we have a single individual we can give a name. Does Cheddar Man have a nickname? Because there's a whole debate about whether we nickname these individuals or we call them, you know, but you know, whether he's just Cheddar Man. This idea of there is a representative of a whole community, a whole society that is facially reconstructed and put on a metaphorical pedestal, and in some cases a real pedestal, you know, as an ancestral figure, I think is a real challenge. And we do that with bog bodies too. We do that with, you know, so many other skeletal remains. So we give this kind of iconic identity. These are all individuals, just one amongst communities, and we often just take that out of a community sense. We want to sort of valorize an individual, make them sort of ancient versions of modern day Instagram celebrities or whatever you call them, you know, these sort of create, you know, influencers. That's the word I was looking for, you know, of which of course I am now one. These individuals get their sort of iconic status, and they're difficult to get beyond. I mean, I would like to see the community of Cheddar Man and the different kinds of ages, genders, diseases, abilities of those individuals in terms of mobility and tasks and activities. But you know, you never get that. All you get is this, ta-da, here is what they look like. And I think that's really problematic and reductive in itself, but that's another rant.
No, I think you're right. It does come into celebrity culture, and it's especially if we're going back to the press, if you're going to talk about an individual, it's great to talk about them as if they were famous and they are the most important person from that time period, just because they happen to have had their remains survive for this long. And it's happened with Cheddar Man. They did studies on modern populations to try and find people who had the same mitochondrial DNA haplogroup. And then it became that they were, you know, connected, and that there were these two amazing individuals separated through time, but like they were kind of trying to compare them to say if they looked alike and things like that. And it's not helpful at all. And I don't think it's something that the scientists ever intended, but it's what the press want to do, because they also write a lot of stories about celebrities and about other things. So it does all come into that context again. And it's nice for a person to look at Cheddar Man and think, wow, that is the face of the Mesolithic. And I can see the appeal of that to the public, but I do agree, yeah, it is problematic, definitely. But I don't think it's something that's going to change anytime soon.
One of those that I refuse to talk about in the public, but I'll happily drop a little line about here because it's not human remains, but another prehistoric celebrity that has been toppled by new research that really annoyed a lot of people, including academics, was Cernabus, the giant at Cernabus. And that the evidence now suggests we are looking at an early medieval hill figure. But there's a lot of reluctance amongst the archaeological community to accept that it can't be either 17th century or prehistoric, because it's such an iconic of primitive Britain of, you know, and I think there's a lot of natural. I was prejudiced. I assumed it would end up being dated as prehistoric, or my suspicion was 17th century. Most people were saying 17th century, and now it's a middle late Anglo-Saxon, early medieval, you know, can't be earlier than the 7th century. And even then in the press, I had a certain dynamic where I was interviewed by a certain correspondent who wanted it to be pagan, had to be the pagan Saxon cult of a god. And, you know, why do you want that when actually the evidence is suggesting a Christian era, you know, whatever it we have no parallels for it. That's the problem. But I suppose my point in this context is that is not even human bones, and still that personality of a object, in this case a hill figure, it could have been an artifact, held such popular, weight, resonance, freight with it of associations with primeval Britain, primitive Britain, not only the big male appendage, but the whole club and the whole masculine identity. This had to be a symbol of ancient Britain, going with Stonehenge, Cernabus, and now it's no longer there in our narratives, and it takes a bit of archaeological work by the National Trust and other archaeologists to do that work. And suddenly, but there was resistance, and it was resistance not based on, oh, I don't believe the science. It's resistance in terms of that doesn't fit my worldview. And now, and it's really, people do get emotionally invested in this. I decided not to blog about anything to do with Cernabus because I saw some of the reactions, and it was almost as passionate as if it was a piece of human body. It wasn't as bad as Cheddar Man, and there was no obvious race equivalent, although he is white if you count, or green, depending on the way you count it. But it's really interesting how it's not just human remains. People get invested in these narratives, and they don't like them disappearing or being challenged, which is what surely archaeology is all about, isn't it? It's about changing and transforming our understanding, enriching and developing our knowledge. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is a problem. People don't see knowledge as cumulative, and it, as you say, it can be difficult when people get so attached to things to let them go. And it's not satisfying. It's nice to have an answer and a fact that you can cling on to, and sort of a nice, well-rounded story with a beginning, middle, and end. And that's not what archaeology offers, and that can be quite sort of alienating to some people, especially the sort of public at large when you're looking at large amounts of comments and things like that. It's just something. It's just a flaw in archaeology. I think it's something that we have to accept, and I don't know if people will ever come around to it, but it's something we have to mitigate.
We never have all the answers, and that's the thing. Sometimes, as with the Cernabus giant, or as in with the broader community of Cheddar Man, we don't have all those bones. We wasn't found in a massive communal cemetery where we have all those. We can't tell. So many aspects of the story are lost to us. And some people say, oh, you know nothing then. You can't say anything about the human past. But surely we can build up a picture from what we've got. I don't know, maybe that's old-fashioned of me.
No, I think the mystery is so enticing that people, like, the mystery of archaeology is a reason why so many people are interested. I think then when we present something as authentic and we say, oh, well, we've solved this mystery, and then we go, actually, we haven't solved it, that's where people get upset.
So you're obviously early days of your research, and I think, Ellie, we won't push you any further to try and solve all our woes, but I've loved having a chance to talk with you about your unfolding ideas, and I suspect you'll be disagreeing with everything that's been published on this topic, including not only my work, but the other important contributions we've seen in journals like Antiquity and Journal of Social Archaeology, where people have been trying to deal with this issue of the politicization of not only the human past, but specifically bioarchaeology. And it's a global debate, but you're looking at UK case studies. But, and we want you to disagree. We want you to give us new answers, new perspectives. And it's going to be really exciting seeing the work you're doing over the next couple of years, Ellie. And I think hopefully this is a good sort of waving of your flag so that other researchers know what you're doing at Chester, and hopefully it'll we'll see other researchers pick up the baton, or develop this as a broader field, because it's so much more work to be done on this area. It's not done and dusted, and we keep seeing new case studies reveal the cracks in our arguments and challenge our limited public engagement, of which we do okay, but there's still so many things we don't do well. And so I'm really looking forward to what your research brings. Do you have any takeaway points for us and the audience about what you see as the future of bioarchaeology and public engagement, or are you going to keep it under wraps for now?
I don't know, a takeaway point. I think the main thing to think about, you say I'm going to disagree with everyone. I probably will. I do I do tend to look at things and think that they could be made better. I think what we need to do as archaeologists is be open-minded, get rid of some of the ego from academia, which is a losing battle, I know, at the start, but we need to acknowledge that there's a problem and be willing to hear from other people and be challenged on this, and not see it as a personal attack, but see it as a way that we have to go towards to develop our discipline. And that's kind of where I would see it. It's just opening our minds. And I'm not saying that you then have to believe everything I say, because I want to hear other people's opinions too. I just think we need to be having more conversations and discussions that don't lead down a path of personal attack or vilification, but really we can then start to make a sort of constructive effort to making the discipline modern and relevant and less problematic in so many ways.
We want constructive answers and ways forward, not just a mudslinging, I think is one of the key things that we're hopefully going to get more of. And I think we see more maturity in the younger scholars than some of the more established scholars in that regard. But that's to be seen. But I wish you well with your research, and I hope Archaeodeath YouTube followers are able to connect into, find out more about your. We'll put description in the description below. We'll put in links to where they can find out more about your ongoing work, and hopefully there'll be publications in the next few years so that people can read up about it. Not pressuring you or anything, you know, in good time.
Definitely.
Thanks so much, Ellie.
Thank you.
For relaxing times, make it Archaeodeath time.